Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our fourth panel this week in our International Seminar of Online Content Moderation. Today's panel is focused on the regulation of fake news. And we are very pleased to have with us today three speakers of the highest caliber. I'll introduce them at a time. And given our focus, we'll have three presentations that will talk about regulation of fake news to some extent, given each of the speakers' areas of research. And as with the previous panels this week, we'll follow with a Q&A. You can all post questions on the YouTube channel. You can also post questions for the attendees that are joining us on the Zoom call. You can also use Zoom, and we'll pick some of the questions. We'll try to address all of them if time allows. So please feel free to post the questions on the chat whenever. You don't have to wait after all of the speakers are done. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker today, Chris Marsden. Chris is a professor at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom since 2013, and he's the founder and director of the Center for Information Governance Research. He's also the author of books on net neutrality, Regulating Code, 2013, Internet Co-Regulation, this is from 2011, and other books that are internationally renowned. Chris has obtained a Laws Bachelor and an LLM from the London School of Economics and a PhD from the University of Essex. So Chris, floor is yours. Welcome, and we're very pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you, Ivar and Yasmin and Gabriela, for the invitation. And thank you for allowing me to speak in English, apart from saying obrigado and bom dia. That's about my entire stock of Portuguese. So apologies for being the stupid Englishman at the conference. I'm going to present giving you some slides, and these will explain some of the research that I've done on the legal regulation of disinformation, fake news, based on reports that were presented to the European Parliament at the end of 2018, and another report that was presented to what is now called the Commonwealth, but used to be called the Commonwealth of Nations, which is the 56 formerly British colonies, I suppose, that are now members of the Commonwealth. So that includes South Africa, India, which of course has the world's largest democratic elections, and many other countries, about 56 countries there, 27 now in the European Union. It was 28 until Brexit. And actually of those 27, 2 are actually members of the Commonwealth as well. So there's 2 that overlap. And we'll have that as a quiz question. Which 2 European Union countries are actually members of the Commonwealth as well? So that's what I'm going to present for you. The background is fake news. The background is actually Johannesburg, because that's where I was actually presenting for this Commonwealth report. And I should say the work that I'm presenting is work that I've done with colleagues, Professor Ian Brown, who's a visiting research professor at FGV in Brazil. Also Tricia Meyer, Dr. Tricia Meyer, who's a professor at the Institute of European Studies at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium, and also Dr. Michael Beale of University College London. So that I've had various collaborators. When you reach my age, you need lots of collaborators to help you to keep energy going. And I should say, you mentioned that my degrees were from London. My first degree, my students are always amazed when they hear, my bachelor's degree in law is from 1989 from the London School of Economics. So I'm very past millennium. Okay, so with that introduction, I will take 20 minutes. I'm just checking my clock. So it's 3:44 here in the UK, and I will stop, I promise, at 4:05. I'm going to switch off my video, share slides, and please don't put on the chat, but shout out to me if you can't hear the sound anymore, because if you put it on the chat, I won't even see it. So just shout out if that's the problem. Okay, video off, slides on. Okay, there's the slides. There's always a little pause as we get them to work. Get them to work properly. There we go. Perfect. Hopefully everyone can see the slides full screen.
Yes, yes.
Right. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about some regulatory options. And I'm going to base it around this idea, the co-regulatory triangle that some of you may not have seen before. The idea is law is only one part of a very large series of regulatory steps we can take. From voluntary compliance at the bottom, to self-regulation by industry, to co-regulation between government and industry. Standards float somewhere in there, but if we're talking about legal standards, then they would be somewhere near the top. And at the absolute peak of the pyramid are what law students often think of as the only thing that matters, which is regulation, laws, enforcement, courts, and so on. So that's the triangle. And the things I'm going to talk about assume that we have an interaction between all of these forces as we go along. Okay, so fake news. Fake news is false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. But actually, it can be both of those things. So it can be to damage for private reasons or for profit. That's the European Commission, the high-level expert group's definition of disinformation. And the distinction we have to draw is between disinformation and misinformation. So if it's unintentional, false or inaccurate information, that would be misinformation, not disinformation. Having said that, if I present something which is false, and then Ivar tells me that it's false and tells me to correct it, and I don't correct it, at that point, it's disinformation. Because if I've been told it's false and I don't correct it, that's the problem. Here's the most important point to make of the whole presentation. If policy and law requires hard evidence of disinformation's effects, it does not and has never existed. I cannot tell you that there was a famous instance in the UK, the 1992 general election. We cannot prove newspapers created the result of that election. Disinformation is not proven to influence significantly the election of President Trump in 2016. I think disinformation cannot be proven, even if it's strongly suspected, to have influenced the presidential election in Brazil either. So we have to separate our belief in anecdote. As computer scientist friends say to me, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. Okay, just because we think it influences things, we cannot prove it. But it's very important to say, if you say you won't take moves against fake news until you see the hard evidence, that's impossible. That's a threshold you cannot achieve. It's a threshold you couldn't achieve in the age of newspapers, and it's a threshold you couldn't achieve in the age of broadcasting, radio, television, okay? Disinformation is what is part of a much broader behavioral, psychological mass experiment, which is the mass media. You cannot demonstrate that disinformation on its own causes elections to swing. And I think that's very important to realize. So when a politician says to you, show me the hard evidence, well, I'm afraid you can show them lots of evidence. Can't show them that this definitely, distinctly affected in a way which is decisive. Yeah? So let's just be aware of that. Okay, and that also brings us to the question about whether we really are getting obsessed about online disinformation, and we should be more concerned about broadcasting or idle gossip that people engage in. Because actually most people, particularly most older people, still rely on the existing media, cable television, news papers, what in America they call shock jock radio, talk radio. And there's of course an interaction between these things and their online presences and what we think of as more online media. Also, elderly people will rely on existing media more than they will rely even on Facebook, and certainly much more than they rely on. TikTok is not something which my grandmother worries about, and neither would most people's grandmothers, I think. But then there is also an effect, which again we cannot measure in terms of hard evidence, the pollution, as it's sometimes referred to, of online disinformation into the mainstream media, as it's so called, the MSM. We don't know how much they're influencing each other and how hard they are. Okay, and so it may well be that online platforms are more important in some ways for media law and for media lawyers in telling us about the weaknesses in the existing ecosystem. So think of it, to use this weird English expression, which I know doesn't really translate into Portuguese, the canary in the coal mine, the idea of the bird in the cage that falls off the cage dead when it smells gas. Well, it's kind of the digital canary in the media coal mine. It's an issue of, can we demonstrate really how broken our existing media laws are because of the online laws? And to sort of cut to the end of my presentation, I will really say at the end that we cannot effectively regulate online disinformation. And so therefore, what we can regulate is actually the offline stuff which influences it. Okay, and it's also worth saying, of course, there's a huge influence of mainstream media clips in online disinformation. And so the way in which deep fakes are, for instance, generated typically from broadcasting that is then, or broadcasting on newspaper images, which then have changes made to them very clearly. Okay. At this point, I feel like I should cough to pretend that I'm feeling ill, because I know that tends to be in a lot of the fake images in particularly the United States election at the moment. All right. So can misinformation affect the discourse, the normative context of the discourse? Yes, of course it can. And one of the things it's done, of course, is that we don't know anymore. And this is where perhaps students should read, rather than reading media lawyers like me, maybe they should read Hannah Arendt and some of the political philosophers. What it's done, of course, is to undermine some democratic principles, because we just aren't entirely sure what's true and what's false anymore. And so it's creating this this kind of problem of knowing what the narrative truth, which can be very important. And that can be spread by a lack of belief in the integrity of data, and the lack of belief in the integrity of data leads us to a lack of belief in the integrity of the overall election discourse. If you want one example of that today, if you look on Twitter, which old people look at a lot, but journalists and politicians think is important, even though they know that it doesn't have a very wide distribution. The big concern today is about the advisor to President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and the question about whether or not he was somehow sexually gratifying himself in a hotel room being filmed for a feature film made by Sacha Baron Cohen. I'm not joking, that is actually today the biggest political discussion in the United States. That's the level we've sunk to. That at this point, 12 days before the US presidential election, we're concerned about images shared online of a feature film which has not yet appeared, and how that might be influencing what we think of this guy, Rudy Giuliani. Why does it matter what we think of Giuliani? Well, it matters because Giuliani himself has been spreading news about claiming that emails from the son of his opponent, Vice President Biden, are somehow influencing the election. So we've sunk into this very weird rabbit hole of rumor and counter rumor and other things. And if it makes people distrust democracy and politicians, well, that can be one of the outcomes that actually disinformation campaigns are trying to achieve, to make people hate politics. And I believe this was one of the strong messages that President Bolsonaro was pushing in Brazil, that you shouldn't trust the existing politicians, you should trust him. I imagine things have moved on since the election substantially. Here we are. General Hayman, the former director of the US National Security Agency, says hacking into emails, the thing that was being discussed both in the 2016 election and the 2020 election in the United States, well, that's kind of what security services do. And they didn't want to go into a court and deny that it happens. So in a way, when we talk about disinformation, and if I can, at this point, acknowledge the fact that I'm the kind of, I'm the Anglosphere voice in the room, well, that's kind of what the British and Americans have been doing to other people's elections for decades and decades, including, of course, in Brazil in the coup in the 1960s. There was strong CIA involvement, which is now not denied anymore. So, let's be aware, this is not new. Including actually interfering in the mass media and now, of course, the online media. And this has been going on for a long time. Russia has been interfering in Ukraine since at least 2011, but there's been interference in the political process in other countries since at least the 2000s. And in fact, if I remind you all, the allegations about the sexual relationship between President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, if you can think back that far, That was in 1996, and that first appeared in the Drudge Report, which was an online newspaper. So we've had this discussion for a very long time. It's also worth saying that many governments, I'm taking Malaysia as a simple example here, have basically passed laws about fake news, which basically identify criticism of government as being fake news. So this is kind of predictable for anybody who's looked at internet law for the last 20 years or mass media law for the last 100 years. Governments will often pass laws which are simply designed to stop criticism. And the same thing is happening in Nigeria today, where government is saying that anyone saying the police are misbehaving is spreading. Does this matter? Do we have to do something about it? Well, yes. And I think that those of us who at the end of last year were getting quite fatigued by saying we have to do something about fake news have sort of had some energy generated for us by the fact that we now acknowledge that fake news has become a huge issue in the pandemic. And it's become a very, very substantial issue in terms of wearing of masks and the following of scientific advice. So it's become a very, very major issue. And you can see up there a nice little tweet explaining what nerd immunity would be. If we can actually just teach people not to follow fake news in our families or in our communities, then perhaps we can actually achieve a better attempt at dealing with the pandemic. So the fake news is not just about elections, it is of course about literally about life and death. Can we vaccinate the public against fake news? Well, as you can see here, when you see what people's media consumption is, you can see the difference between the extent to which they believe Bill Gates wants to use vaccines to track people. This is one example of a conspiracy. And look at the extraordinary difference between different groups of people. But also look at the fact that it's really not just about whether they watch Fox News or MSNBC, which is another cable news channel. It's really, that's an indicator of who they are. But don't assume their worldview is formed by Fox News or MSNBC. Their worldview is formed by everything that it is that gives us our political identity. We're not that, we're not that simple. And the discussion is not that binary. And besides which, what if you actually watch, many, many different channels? So I think we should be aware that yes, it can be an indicator, but not the entire indicator. Okay, so just to let you know what we did lots of interviews, and we also looked at lots of literature, and we also basically presented our evidence in lots of different places. This is what we did in 2018. We also actually did a series of seminars in 2020. I was actually getting on a plane at the end of March 2020 to fly to Washington, D.C. to present and chair a seminar at the Library of Congress with the Federal Election Commissioner, Alan Weintraub. That ended up being on Zoom for obvious reasons. The end of March, Washington closed down, the Library of Congress locked down. So we were doing this work over a long period of time. I say a long period. A year and a half, it turns out, in the disinformation landscape makes you a veteran. So yeah, I'm a veteran of a year and a half of research in this space, of direct research. And it's worth also saying that one of the important things is that the studies that we carried out, which are interdisciplinary, they involve political scientists, computer scientists, and legal academics, were really, first of all, guiding us against looking at technicism as a solution. And we really wanted to explain why it is that the computer scientists need to listen to the lawyers as much as the lawyers listen to the computer scientists. Without human intervention, legally trained human intervention, you cannot have effective work to stop fake news and other types of online content that you want to remove. Just quickly moving on to say something perhaps obvious, but which needs reiterating. Literacy and cybersecurity are essential to all types of regulation of disinformation. You need people to basically carry out most of the work themselves. And that involves them actually being literate. And it goes alongside cybersecurity because, of course, fake news is a type of removal of the integrity of data. And it's a really important element to remind ourselves that disinformation is not just part of media law, but it's also part of cybersecurity as well. And I can share some examples in Q&A. Also, I should say, we try not to use the term artificial intelligence, but we were asked to look at what we call automated content recognition, or ACR. Look, that's what AI, because they want to pretend it's magic. But essentially, it's the use of automated content recognition in order to flag up to human moderators the kind of information which is a problem. You do need, but the bottom line is the important one there, you do need ACR to supplement human editing to moderate content at scale, okay? But the problem with that is that ACR is really good at identifying certain things and really bad at identifying other things. ACR, or I'll say AI because that's what it's good at identifying bot accounts. In other words, it can identify a bot account, but also think you're an insomniac. So if it sees lots of posting from Rio de Janeiro at 5 o'clock in the morning, it basically decides that that's probably a bot account, as opposed to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But it's very bad at identifying the actual content of posts, because fortunately, humans are witty and humorous and intelligent. And the things that we say are beyond the ability of computers, no matter how powerful they are, to engage in what they call natural language processing to find out what we're doing. Deep fakes are also almost impossible. I tell all my students all the time that if they ever see a compromising video involving me or a compromising image, it is definitely fake, because they are, of course, so good at these deep fakes these days. What can AI do to stop disinformation? A huge amount, but on the other hand, it's hugely crude. So Facebook announced that they'd removed 1.5 billion accounts in 6 months at the end of 2018. It also can only remove, and this is using their ACR or AI, 38% of hate speech related posts. That is slightly improving. And they found that algorithmic detection of facts has an accuracy of what they think of as a good total of 76%, which means 24% gets past them, which is an extraordinarily high number. Oh, and I should say also, by the way, Facebook only trained their ACR technology in English and Portuguese in 2018. English because, let's face it, they're an American company, and Portuguese because they were concerned about the Bolsonaro election, or rather the presidential election that resulted in his election. Okay. There's a really nice article by Kobler and Cox in interviewing the Facebook moderators about what do they do try and make these things happen. Although again, that will be, dramatically out of date by now. As veterans, we know that 2-year-old information is too old. So let me just wrap up with a couple of proposals. First of all, don't listen to Mark Zuckerberg. He himself admits that actually it's a really difficult problem to out linguistic nuance. So he's very good at banning nipples, but he's very, very bad at banning fake news. We know that there's been controversy for many years that Facebook and WhatsApp are able to train image detection, but very bad at the kind of fake news, natural language. Obvious point to make, legislators should not push the judgment exercise onto online intermediaries. That's what they do always, not just for fake news, but for so many different liability issues. And they expect the intermediaries to be judge, jury, and executioner. And the problem with that is that they will be executioner without a jury or a judge. They will simply remove information that they don't like. So human rights law, and therefore human rights lawyers, therefore every student listening to this, should be being employed by these intermediaries to actually give a proper evaluation. AI is not a silver bullet. Automated technologies, as I've said, are very limited in their accuracy, and legislators need to think about measures that provide a bulwark, that provide a barrier against disinformation without AI-generated censorship of citizens. So essentially, what I've been telling you is a long advert for human rights lawyers to be employed by intermediaries. And I'm going to show you basically as a final point. By the way, I do have some links which I'll share with you later on. But I just want to share this with you as my kind of final slide. It is essentially a range of measures that can be taken from nothing to statutory regulation. And if I take 1 minute just to explain what it involves. The status quo, of course, does not stop. So the status quo does not mean the world stops turning. It means that things do happen. So there will be corporate social responsibility, although I tend to tell my students it's corporate social irresponsibility, and single company initiatives. So Twitter will do different things to Facebook, who will do different things to Google, who will do different things to Netflix, who will do different things to Amazon, for instance. And of course, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and equivalents in Brazil and other countries will be, well, enforcement's a strong term about any privacy law. But there will be some attempts to enforce, and I'll leave it to my colleague in Germany to talk about actual enforcement as opposed to pretending to enforce. They all continue. Non-audited self-regulation is step one beyond that. So industry codes of practice and transparency reports. That has been done to some extent in Europe. And there is something called the Santa Clara Principles that maybe one of my colleagues might talk about later on. There is audited self-regulation. And so in Europe, before the European parliamentary elections of 2019, a code of practice was presented. And the companies actually did report the extent to which they were removing disinformation. And the Global Network Initiative, which is a group of like the GAFAM companies, the little giant companies, essentially, published audit reports which try to show how they're complying with their own standards. And then step three would be a formal self-regulator. Problem with formal self-regulation is that you're then expecting that if someone misbehaves badly, they could somehow be expelled from the industry group. I don't think there's going to be many clubs that would expel Mr. Zuckerberg if they thought his properties were misbehaving. But nevertheless, there are elements of that which are interesting, particularly the idea that if I just take one second to say, I'm not interested in them killing 1.3 billion robot accounts because I have no way of verifying that 1.3 billion. I'm really interested in how many individual accounts or posts they put back up when there was an appeal against its being taken down and they decided they'd made a mistake. And the reason I'm interested in that metric is because that's expensive, because that requires some kind of system of justice or appeal to be put in place, hopefully just, but who knows, in which they actually listen to a complaint from somebody whose content is taken down and they think about the put back up of something where they've made a mistake. And that is incredibly rare. I want to see more of that, or I want to see the documentation of that. That's what's important there. And so the put back metric is really important. And I should say the final two steps are things which my books talk about. Co-regulation, where you would have some kind of industry code approved by Parliament or a regulator with the power to actually insist on legislation where that wasn't successful. Arguably, that's sort of what's happened in Germany, although I'm not the expert, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about that from Clara. And then statutory regulation, where you have a formal system with perhaps with a national regulatory agency, and that would be something very, very much more like having a kind of form of privacy law for disinformation, so a disinformation law. That's much harder to achieve than it sounds because we have lots of existing media regulators. So those are the kind of ideas that I think might be interesting to look at. When I presented this to the European Parliament, they said, oh, yeah, we weren't really planning on moving much beyond point one. So thank you for the other ideas, but they sound a bit dangerous, at least at that stage. But that was 2018. And maybe I'll just leave that slide up and then I'll put my video back on in case there are questions or I've massively exceeded.
Thank you very much, Chris. We will address the questions after the last speaker. So we'll give you, and then Clara also, some time to breathe before starting the questions. And so now we'll move to our second speaker, Clara Iglesias Keller. Clara is a postdoctoral guest researcher in the Politics of Digitalization Research Group of the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung. She is an associated researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. Clara holds a PhD and an MA in public law from the Rio de Janeiro State University. And she also holds an LLM in information technology and media law from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Clara, thank you very much for joining us today. We're very happy and pleased to have you. And the floor is yours. I think your mic is still off.
Please bear with me while I have two screens and the presentation and everything. So thank you, Ivar, so much for inviting me to this panel. Thank you to professors also Ingo Sarit and Danilo Doneda, and for Yasmin and the whole organizers for being so responsive and for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here sharing this conversation with Professor Patricia Hossini and Professor Chris Marsden, and I'm really looking forward to talking to them and why not also pose my own questions. So I'm gonna share my screen now. You will have to excuse my very poor PowerPoint abilities. I just put something up together to help us be on the same page. So let me share the screen. And so does that work?
Yes, but I think you're on presentation mode, so
okay.
We're actually seeing the very, very small slides.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to change. I'm sorry.
Maybe use slideshow. I think there was a button there.
It's because I have two screens. Does it work now? Or still bad?
It's still as before. I think there's a button called live slideshow, maybe.
And now?
No, still the same.
You might just have to flip the screen that you're sharing. So when you select to share your screen, there's two options. You just have to flip them so that we are seeing the screen with the slides and not the, it gets confusing when you have two screens.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, Patricia. Thank you so much. Just a second. I'm so sorry about this, guys.
That's fine.
Okay, so are we good now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what I want to talk to you about today is, well, we have been having this conversation about disinformation in Brazil so intensely for the past months. It's even hard to select what is it that we're going to talk about at this point. But what I prepared to do is to divide my presentation in three parts. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research on disinformation, which I developed at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research in Hamburg. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brazilian debate on disinformation and how it relates to my research. And by the end, I'm going to talk about Bill of Law 2630 that is being discussed. And I chose two aspects of this law to talk a little bit more about. And full disclosure, I did it because I know that my co-panelists have notorious expertise in these subjects. And I would really like to hear their take on them and on my interpretations of it. Ivar, I owe you an apology for trying to stir this conversation a certain way, which would originally be your job today. So jumping right into it, well, as Professor Chris Marsden has already pointed out, this information requires answers from different actors and different sorts of answers. What I was focusing in was on regulatory strategies, statutory regulation. I also was focusing on the dissemination through digital means of false, inaccurate, the same European Commission definition that Professor Chris Marsden has mentioned before. So something that is spread intentionally and that applies in or outside of electoral processes and that is disseminated through digital means. My diagnosis and my recommendations at first were based on the Brazilian experience, but I did elaborate them based on international literature and global experience of disinformation regulation. I was very driven by the question of what would be the regulatory target when we're talking about regulating disinformation, because this was a project that I submitted now a year and a half ago, and I was still trying to understand, okay, if we are to regulate disinformation, what is it that we have to regulate? And my initial drafts even have the title of "Don't restricting speech disproportionately," which is something that apparently internet regulation struggles a lot with. So the first thing I did was to look for regulatory strategies, look for regulatory experiences, and I divided them in 3 groups according to the regulatory target. So I have regulations that target speech. They're about regulating content and individuals. And here I am talking about mechanisms that criminalize conducts related to this information, like producing, spreading, forwarding. This also includes provisions that enhance pre-existing libel and slander sanctions, or that grant authorities or digital platforms with power to remove content. In the second group, I put the initiatives that targeted data. So this is basically regulation of data collection and data treatment, because misuse of data often has a central role in mass disinformation strategies, mass disinformation campaigns, and it can also be expressed through, for instance, the limitation or even prohibition of political data use or for political micro-targeting. And last, we have what I call structure regulation, which targets intermediaries' business models. So we have liability regimes, we have transparency, due process, and accountability related obligations. Recently, European literature refers a lot to this sort of strategy as a shift from liability to responsibility or from liability to duty. In the UK, there is, and I'm sure Patrícia and Chris will be able to give more information on this, the UK debate based on the online harms paper that calls for a duty of care. The important thing here is that this does not target individuals, this does not target conduct, it targets business models, but it's also not a policy that is only about this information. It encompasses a broader range of online harms, but we're still talking about the same sorts of mechanisms. So in Brazil, before March 2020, before this year, the vast majority of legislative proposals were in the first group. So it was bills of law that imposed criminal sanctions, that created new criminal conducts targeting disinformation. We have so far one law approved, which is about electoral disinformation, that makes a crime for you to give cause to an administrative or criminal investigation process if you spread disinformation about someone in an electoral process. We also had, by March, a very weak institutional data protection framework, which is frankly a roller coaster in Brazil, because we have setbacks, we go forward, then we set back, then we go forward again. So, and the problem with that is that these sort of strategies that focus on speech and on criminalization of speech, they fall real short on human rights-based legitimacy tests, as in they are very likely to impose disproportional restrictions on people's freedom of expression rights. They're likely to generate chilling effects, and they do not address the core of the country's most significant disinformation strategy identified by the literature to date, which happened during the 2018 elections. So after March 2020, and just like opening my heart here to other researchers, this shift happened right when I was writing my paper, and I had to start writing and rewriting it, and I haven't made peace with this process. But going back to it, after March 2020, there's been a shift in this regulatory debate. The first bills of law that were presented, can you still hear me? Okay, so the first bills of law that were presented were very focused on disinformation. Still, some even brought a few of speech targeting mechanisms. But then we have seen a lot of versions, a lot of different bills were presented by different representatives. And what we have now is that a discussion that started focused on this information gained scope of an internet transparency, liberty, and responsibility law. And the proposal that's on the table right now actually encompasses all sorts of online harms, is not specifically targeting this information, at least not officially and expressly. It is partially inspired by the NetCDG and other foreign proposals, and it has a real mix of regulatory targets. But I believe that in its core is the idea of structural regulation that I have spoken about earlier. I just forgot to mention before that this classification that I use, I realize it's not an absolute and static classification. There can be policies that will fall within more than one target, and it's not supposed to be something absolutely separated. It's just a way to help visualize what are the policies that we're talking about, their advantages and their limitations. So Bill of Law 2630/2020 is the one that we're talking about right now, where all these debates are now centered. It's in this draft. And we even have two drafts, because the absolutely official draft is the one that left Senate, but the House of Representatives has already made another draft public, even though it is not officially a new version. So bear with me while I try to tell you about what are the provisions right now, considering that there are two different versions. So as I told you, there's a mix of different regulatory targets. There's, for instance, civil registration and identification in order to access platforms is something that has been more heavily proposed. Now it's reserved for specific cases where the platforms will have the possibility of asking for somebody's documents and identification in order for them to still have an account on that platform. We have a range of obligations for private messaging apps, some provisions that aim to insert content moderation with due process and accountability principles. A lot of transparency reports on content moderation, on advertisement, on electoral advertisement. We have provisions regarding public interest social network accounts, as in the accounts that mandated representatives have and that they use to communicate with the general public. And we have, by the end of the bill, what in one version is called regulated self-regulation, and that the semi-official one, to my surprise and quite honestly to my confusion, is called multi-stakeholder co-regulation. So now I'm going to jump specifically into my selection, my random and not so random selection of provisions. And I think these cases, they also show that, like, when you have such a diverse mix of regulatory mechanisms being proposed in one single bill, and with a debate that is being led in this considerable speed, you are going to leave something untied. Some things aren't going to go right, because it's a lot of very complex regulatory mechanisms, actually, whose efficiency is not even guaranteed, and they're all being combined and rushed through the legislative process. So regarding messaging apps regulation, we have now obligations/possibilities for public authorities, mostly to platforms, I'm sorry. So we have platforms being obligated to account suspension in some cases, of forwarding messaging limits, prohibition of external softwares being used. And at some point, or at least if you consider the official version, we still have an obligation of metadata storage, which meant, well, we don't know which version is going to be the one, but what was considered at some point was that communications that reached 1,000 individuals within 2 weeks would be considered no longer private messaging, but they would be considered like communication that reached like a mass communication characteristic. And for that reason, the apps would be obligated to storage these messages for 3 months, I guess. I know that Ivar has made so much work on this, has done a lot of work on this provision, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. So basically it obligated WhatsApp and messaging apps to storage communication, at first metadata on this sort of communication that reached a certain number of people. So the foundation of this provision was that private communication is not so private anymore once it reaches a certain number of people. And I see a lot of problems with that premise. Not that I do not think that, not that I think that is absolutely wrong. And I haven't even made up my mind yet on whether WhatsApp should be regulated to this degree here. But my problems with this right now is that to which point private communications becomes mass communication. What's the criteria here that was used? Why are we talking about a message reaching 1,000 people? Why not 2,000? Why not 3,000? And why within 2 weeks? What if it's lasts longer? I'm not even going to get into the whole content issues as in the sort of content that is absolutely legal that can reach even more people than that. It just bothers me that there is this provision that is actually very symbolic and can have severe consequences for communication regulation, and we're not even talking about the premises that base this. So, and my second point is that mass communication in Brazil is not even that heavily regulated. You know, like even if we talk about how we regulate mass communication, Brazil is one of the experiences that still comes with a lot of concentration mechanisms. And now that we're talking about regulate online communications, we see ourselves trying to expand to these services obligations that are not even really that implemented for mass communication. We don't have a tradition of regulating impartiality, of regulating fairness. So why are we doing that now? So does that mean that we need new foundations for communications regulation? You know, I see the point here. I see that this is an attempt to regulate a tool that is considered to having been key in the disinformation campaign that happened in 2018. I am just really cautious and really worried about premises that are guiding this proposal here. And I look forward to hearing from Professor Patricia Hossini on this. This is not nice, right? Already posing a question while you barely finished your own presentation. So I apologize for that, Patricia. And the second one, the multi-stakeholder co-regulation. So this is what it is here. There are two bodies being proposed. One is a transparency council, which will receive and evaluate transparency reports, validate codes of conduct, enact studies, opinions, and recommendations on freedom, responsibility, and transparency on the internet. It is even supposed to validate a code of good practice to be agreed with the sector. So it is a transparency council. It will be connected not to the executive branch, but to the legislative, to parliament. And one thing that bothers me about the design of this transparency council is that it includes platforms representatives in the board among its members, when it is very clear to me an institution that will be responsible for enforcing this law and for monitoring if the sector is in fact abiding by it. So why would you have representatives from the agents that are going to be monitored in the body that will monitor and potentially start the processes that could eventually sanction them? So that's, you know, it's my main concern here. And then the second body is called, in this current version, a multi-stakeholder co-regulation institution. So it does not strike me as a multi-stakeholder institution, right? Because there's not really a concern with multi-stakeholder sorts of processes. There is not a shared representativity of different stakeholders. In fact, I see a really crisis of identity here in this institution. Its competences are around creating and managing a transparency platform. So it's supposed to be created by the sector, you know, like for platforms gather together and create this multi-stakeholder co-regulation institution. And it could create and manage a transparency platform. It would have more like procedural competences, like receiving complaints from users. And it could elaborate good practices code along with telco companies for account suspension, as in when should users' phone accounts being suspended. And this is something that I have no idea how it got into this sort of competences here, because it is clearly a very serious and severe sort of sanctioning for individuals. And yet it is in this institution that it is basically, it looks right now like a private institution. In fact, in the previous version of this bill, it was called a self-regulatory institution. It was very much based on the NetzDG from Germany. So what the NetzDG has is, instead of a transparency council, the obligations are monitored and sanctioned by, if I'm not mistaken, by a organ of the Ministry of Justice in Germany. And the law, the NetzDG in this case, also provides that the sector can create a self-regulatory body to help manage these obligations and these transparency reports. But the thing is that didn't really work here in Germany, you know? So this body was actually never created. There is in fact one body that already existed, a self-regulatory one, that is trying to get an approval to act as this sort of institution, but that has not happened yet. So that would be enough reason to treat this very cautiously before importing it. But also the NetzDG has a completely different scope from this law that is being proposed here. The NetzDG is a law that applies to 22 criminal conducts provided by the German Criminal Code. So this bill here would apply to all sorts of online harms, you know, that can take place in a platform. So it's clearly, this for me is like a very good example on how rushing with this debate and trying to put up this level of complexity, of institutional complexity in such, with such little debate can really lead up to something that can not only be bad, but also how is this supposed to work? You know, so I apologize if I'm too much into these versions and I keep referring to one and another. Just excuse the fact that I have been into this for so long now and it's actually getting a bit blurred. So my point with this proposal is co-regulation. Yes, I think this should be a good standard for us to regulate platforms, and Professor Chris Marsden has extensive work on co-regulation for regulating internet-based services. Is this co-regulation right now? I'm not even sure. I don't think so. I don't think this multi-stakeholder co-regulatory body is neither of those things. I think a co-regulatory arrangement could come out of this bill of law, but it would need a bit of work on the institutional identity and on the institutional competences of these bodies that are being proposed. And as I mentioned already, this was clearly influenced by the German regulation. So I'm reaching the end of my presentation and I have a few takeaways to share with you. The first one being that I think this bill of law is an important initiative, and it's not an isolated one. So as I mentioned before, we see perhaps not global yet, but we see in a lot of other experiences a shift to policies that are more focused on structure. So I don't think this is because Brazil had the 2018 elections only. I think this is also a reflection in our regulatory culture of a movement that is also happening in other places. So I think there is a claim for regulatory innovation. I think there is something to be done. But I do think this level of mixed strategies in a very short time frame means that we will have bad regulation or no regulation at all, because either there will be no agreement over this, or we will end up approving these institutions that are not really thought through. My second takeaway is that a shift in Brazil, a shift from targeting speech to target structure was also a shift from disinformation to online harms, actually, because we're not talking about only disinformation anymore. So when I remember my first questions when I started my research, can we regulate disinformation without regulating speech? I don't know. I start to wonder if regulators should actually stick to structure and let other actors worry about content. Should that be a job for fact checking? Should that be a job for, I don't know, even platforms, depending on their terms and service? Should regulation not be so focused on disinformation in itself? And we also have like a real problem here, which is distinguishing legal from illegal content, right? The way that the law and the way that platforms handle legal and illegal content so far, it is a matter to which I believe we haven't been paying enough attention. We have many times we have liability systems, for instance, that apply to both sorts of content, and we talk about two very different things. You know, actually not two, but so many very different things. Hate speech or content that is not appropriate for minors, or nudity. Some of these things are illegal, some are not. Some are in an even more gray area. So I'm not sure this should be a duty for the law. And my third point is that the shift to structure will not necessarily not threat rights and liberties. And I think that one good example of this is the proposal for regulating messaging apps. So this is what I wanted to talk about, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much once again for having me.
Thank you very much, Clara. I'll now introduce our third and final speaker. We are very pleased to have Patricia Hossini with us today. She's a professor and researcher at the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Liverpool. Patricia was previously a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. She holds a PhD in communication from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and she researches misinformation and civic participation with grants from Facebook, Twitter, and the Knight Foundation. Thank you, Patricia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Perfect. I don't have slides to show, so you're just gonna be stuck with me. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this important seminar to discuss moderation and freedom of speech. I especially thank Professors Danilo Daneda, Ingo Sarlet, and Ivar Hartmann. I don't know you personally, but I would be delighted to, so maybe next time we do this in person. And also to Julia Monteiro, who has reached out to me and with whom I've been contacting through email as an organizer. So when Julie reached out, she sent me a list of several topics that I could focus on, and because I have a terrible inability to choose, I just decided to kind of speak a bit about them all. And to start, even though following Chris and Clara, we already talked a little bit about the conceptual muddiness, I will start talking about a little bit the conceptual muddiness about online disinformation and fake news, and why that is a challenge, and why that has been proving to be a bit of a problem when we think about regulatory approaches. So first of all, fake news as a label is an oxymoron, right? Because news refers to accurate accounts of real events, and it is normatively grounded on truth. So if it is fake, it can't be news, right? And part of the reason why this label has been so widely used is that fake news sometimes will consist of similar structural approaches of real news. So like it looks like real news, has headlines and text. Sometimes it has a picture or video. So it's kind of sometimes fabricated or made to look like real news. But fake news as a label muddies the waters that we have to understand what are the different types of content that circulate with online. So we can talk about false, exaggerated, misleading, fabricated, partially truthful, biased claims, right? In the UK's framework of online harms, for instance, that Clara has hinted at, false information is actually classified under this gray area precisely because it's so hard to define and to regulate. So, you know, in a nutshell, it is a hot mess. In the past, we used to talk about fake news to refer to satire or parody, and by past I mean like pre-2016. So, you know, websites that talked about humor, making fun of real news and political elites. So, for instance, sites like Sensacionalista, right, a very popular Brazilian outlet that makes fun of news headlines. It looks like a newspaper, but it's also very clear about the fact that nothing that is there is true, right? Sites like Sensacionalista are actually, you know, they're gonna go out of business because politics in Brazil is so messy right now that actual real news looks just like Sensacionalista. But anyway, the idea of humor and satire is that they are all based upon the premise that the audience knows it is a joke, took part on that joke, and that those who produce this type of content are also clear about their intent, right? But fake news is also used in reference to completely fabricated stories, for instance, and that are created to mislead. So we could say like the gay kid controversy during the 2018 election in Brazil, or even the claim that Pope Francis had endorsed Trump in 2016. Like these are stories that have no resemblance to truth. They're just fabricated. They're just there to mislead, right? Fake news is also used to refer to the manipulation of real pictures or real videos. So today it's like very fancy to talk about deep fakes, so videos that are edited and altered to make it look like someone is doing something that they're not, right? But sometimes it can be just as simple as misappropriation, which is actually a lot more damaging. So using real news from real events, but portraying them to refer to something else. So for instance, in South Africa, there is a famous case of this picture of a bus that had caught fire in the road, and then it was circulated on WhatsApp groups as if a particular group of refugees was responsible for that event. And no, it was just like a bus that caught fire during an accident, right? So this, again, very common. Some scholars will also describe fake news as propaganda, so referring to political stories that are biased or one-sided, that aim to benefit politicians, governments, or organizations. And one interesting thing about propaganda is that it is actually often based on facts. It just doesn't really show a full picture of them. So propaganda is not necessarily false, or but it is intentionally misleading because it typically will fall in political propaganda, not advertising, but it will typically portray facts in a way that is kind of one-sided, kind of hiding out the other side, so that whoever has the intent to deceive is looking nice. Most of the scholarly definitions of fake news or false information or misinformation, they typically include two dimensions. One is the facticity, so the extent to which information is true or false, right? And second is the intention, so focusing on whether or not those who create or author fake news have the intention to mislead. So if we go back to like satire and parody, even if the content is typically false or exaggerated, there is no intention to mislead, right? Whereas if we talk about propaganda or we talk about fabricated news, such as, you know, gay kid or, you know, Pope Francis endorsing Trump, they actually do have the intention to mislead. Clara talked about this, and also Chris, when they discussed the distinction between you know, disinformation and misinformation, which is basically focused on intent, right? And that is a very important distinction, because even though those who create fake news always have the intent to deceive, those who take part in the dissemination may not, right? So to borrow from Chris and not be the only person who brings grandma to the room, my grandma is always my example because she is a very prolific WhatsApp user. When my grandma sends me a text saying that using my smartphones at night will give me eye cancer, I know she does believe that it's possibly true. And I know that she's trying to inform me. She doesn't know or have the intention to misinform. However, she is contributing to the spread of fake news, right? She is contributing for this message to go around because she sent this to me. She probably sent this to all my, all the other granddaughters, probably sent to all her kids too, and a bunch of friends, right? So a lot of people with really good intentions might be contributed to dissemination, but they are not the ones with intent to disinform. And another interesting bit of the topic of disinformation is that it does exceed the concept of fake news, because when we talk about disinformation, we go well beyond this idea that fake news are content that are fabricated to look like real news, right? So we do have those websites. We have websites that play around with just looking like real news. But when we talk about disinformation, we might be talking about, memes, images, just plain text on WhatsApp. They always come from a doctor. They always come from like someone with authority, right? But they are sometimes like testimonial, real stories, right? I'm a doctor, I know this, and I'm telling you that the vaccine has a 5G chip and Bill Gates is gonna come for you when you're sleeping, right? But it's always like a sense of authority, no resemblance to news. And disinformation is a better concept because it actually will capture that as well as, news that are fabricated to look like real news. Some of the current legislative efforts in Brazil will reflect part of this issue. The last version that I read of the project, and might not be actually the latest because things are changing very fast, as Clara pointed out, described fake news as messages containing facts that are knownly untruthful or subjected to legal action. What does that mean? Like, would messages that makes truthful and false information be determined to be fake news or actionable content? What about messages that have incomplete or partial accounts of facts that may lead to misperception, even if there is some resemblance to real facts? Like, would those be also actionable? Would those be out? Like, these concept doesn't really tell me what type of content we should be caring about. And as far as I know, and I think the two presentations before me made that quite clear, no regulatory approach has made significant progress in defining how misinformation or disinformation or fake news should be typified, which types of content should be included and whatnot. And as if I'm correct, Chris pointed out, and I think Clara pointed that out as well, in some of the countries where these types of legislation has been enforced, it actually leads to loopholes that allow people to exploit and start to undermine political dissent in itself and not misinformation. So legislation that is designed to curb misinformation has been abused by political leaders to actually silence dissent and curb freedom of speech. So it's what Clara pointed out quite well during her presentation, this slippery slope between what you can do in terms of regulation and the extent to which regulation can undermine human rights, right? Another interesting aspect that is perhaps less explored, but to me quite dangerous and speaks a bit more to my research, is the use of fake news as a label, not really as a genre, right? Like, so legislation usually talks about fake news as describing content, or misinformation as describing content, disinformation as describing content. But something that's very prominent, especially since 2016, is the use of fake news as a label. So when people, mainly political elites, I don't need to name the cattle, will call out fake news to disqualify actual news and undermine the credibility of media outlets and so on. And we have some evidence, for instance, recent research from Yochai Benkley at the Berkman Center in Harvard, suggesting that actually the main actors responsible for the spread of misinformation online are political elites. So not only politicians, but also journalists and the news media that contribute to amplify misleading and false claims instead of the general public. So even though it is a bit of a problem that my grandma will forward WhatsApp messages to me, at times when she feels I really need to know, and even if it's completely false, we perhaps need to think a bit more about who are the powerful actors that have the power to spread these types of information at scale and with influence, right? So while we have been very rightfully so concerned with the amount of fake news that's flooding streams of Facebook or WhatsApp, the use of fake news as a label, and again, enacted by political elites, has pretty detrimental consequences to undermine democracy. And those can be and have been measured, right? So two of the primary consequences of that is undermining trust in media in the first place, which is a problem for misinformation, because then if you don't trust media, then where do you get your news? Please not on WhatsApp, but that's where you go, right? Like where do you turn to if you can't trust the news media? And the second is to undermine trust in political institutions. So if all that is against me is fake news, how can the public discern what's true? And how can the public navigate this polluted environment that is polluted not only because a lot of people are spreading fake news, but particularly because very specific, powerful, influential people with a lot of reach are spreading and bolstering this type of rhetoric. So I think just to close this conceptual point, the conceptualization of what is fake, what is not, what should be regulated and what not is pretty challenging to define, and perhaps a better approach to discussing effective means to curb the spread of information online is to focus on structural aspects and also intent and actors, and a bit less on the nuances and debates about what is fake news and what not. Perhaps with this approach, we would be a bit less at risk of undermining particular forms of speech, and perhaps a bit more focus on disinformation campaigns, on large-scale campaigns and initiatives that are actually and purposefully trying to muddle the waters of our democracies. Right, so the second topic that I wanted to talk about, because again, I can't choose, is the role of public institutions in this regulatory scheme, right? So far, with very few exceptions, platforms have been basically left to their own devices to self-regulate. And before COVID, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram were pretty light touch, especially with political content. But the pandemic kind of is forcing them to step up very fast, started to curb health-related misinformation, which is, again, and I think that was a presentation before me, arguably a lot more concerning, was Chris' presentation, a lot more concerning than political news, right? So if it is a problem if we're talking about whether or not this government has this policy and whatnot, it is a bit more of a problem if we talk about how to combat, COVID, you should drink bleach. Bit more dangerous, bit more, detrimental to people's health. You can die. So it is a bit more concerning, and maybe because of that, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Google kind of jumped on this opportunity to say, hey, we're here, we are doing a bit of something here. But what ends up happening, in fact, is that Twitter, Facebook, and the other platforms are playing whack-a-mole to curb COVID-related misinformation and now electoral-related misinformation during the elections in the US, with policies that change all the time, with approaches that are inconsistent across platforms, and also this ongoing change to address new threats, right? Which adds to the confusion, for instance, of having an election in the middle of the pandemic. Hot mess. One of the problems, the problem with self-regulation for me is kind of twofold. The first problem is that in many ways, the business model of social media platforms centered on algorithmic news feed is to maximize engagement. And it is because it maximizes engagement that we are where we are, right? We know that bandwagon heuristics, so when we see likes and shares and etc., will lead to more people to share content. So if things, rich gets richer, things are starting to go viral, they only have a greater likelihood to become more and more viral. The more you see people sharing, the more you're inclined to share. There's also the appeal of false content, right? So research by Sinan Aran at the MIT looking at 10 years worth of Twitter data, suggested that misinformation or false information, whatever we want to call it at this point, tends to actually be a lot more novel and attractive, attention grabbing than real news. So, in this attention economy, that for platforms, what matters is how long you spend there, how much you click and engage. That is a big of a problem, right? So if platforms actually want to curb and can actually curb misinformation, they actually must consider and change the very same mechanics that make their platform so engaging and appealing to the public, and hence so profitable for themselves. The second problem is that even if platforms have policies to determine the type of contents that can be removed, and they do have such policies, although they typically talk more about hateful and violent speech than they do about misinformation, platforms do seem to be just incapable to enforce their own policies, and to do so evenly, particularly when political actors are involved. So Facebook, for instance, has a policy of not fact-checking politicians, right? And that is one of the reasons why they've been the target of much more scrutiny than Twitter during the initial bits of the election in the US. Still so. But their own policy came back to bite them, because now they have a policy about removing COVID-related misinformation, and also any misinformation about the voting and electoral process in the United States. And it just so happens that the president himself is the one spreading both types. So, so what goes? Is it the policy that you don't fact check politicians, or the policy that COVID-related misinformation cannot be up? And if it's in one case you go here, and the other case you go there, what do we do? What should be removed and what not, right? So when left to their own devices, in my opinion, companies end up sending mixed messages and operating with mixed standards in inconsistent ways, therefore just adding to the confusion to the public of what's true, what's not, what's actionable content, what is not. And a third point, even though I said it was just two, as COVID and the current presidential election have been showing, fighting misinformation without clear policies and a coherent cross-platform approaches really means that each platform is playing, putting down fires as they spark with their own way of doing so. And they create more inconsistencies in how they approach these types of content that further confuse the public, such as, for instance, when Twitter takes something down, but Facebook leaves it up. So again, if there is no consistency and cohesion in what types of content should be actionable and what types of content are not, then it really depends on where you go. And you as a public, right, might be very confused as to why this shows up in one way if you're in one platform, in another way in another platform, and in the third just doesn't show up at all. Like, what do you do? I think that this lack of coherency and consistent is a big source of confusion for the public, and it just contributes to undermine trust in platforms, in news, in institutions overall. Also, and relatedly, since platforms decide not only what to moderate, but also how to moderate, sometimes deleting, but sometimes just adding flags to content, it is just not clear for all users, for instance, whether Facebook or Twitter are applying these labels to content that they have themselves determined as false, why that content was determined as false, who checked if it was false, right? Raising even more concerns, controversies, and frankly, mistrust around platform biases, which just contribute to undermine what I mentioned before, which is trust in the media ecosystem, trust in institutions overall, and trust in democracy, right? So to this point, at least in my view, the role of regulators is to determine clear and more coherent responsibilities that should inform how platforms deal with content. The point of regulating in this context should be more to add transparency, determine more clear cross-platform policies and procedures, and create bodies to monitor how platforms are enforcing rules. It is obviously much, much easier to set such regulations during special periods of time, such as elections, and perhaps that would be a good way to start before we try to just, hold the world with our own both hands, rushing a debate that is much more complicated than any of our legislative bodies is capable to talk about. The last point that I wanted to talk about, because it's one of the ways in which platforms have been advancing in this very specific context of elections, is political micro-targeting. And to me, this is just a practical example of how self-regulation is just fundamentally flawed and failed. So practical example of this is how initiatives around political advertising in elections that have been designed by Facebook or Google or Snapchat even are just fundamentally flawed. They create this on the surface idea that Facebook is now being very clear about who advertises and how much they're paying for and who is seeing things. But if you spend any time and I mean it, 30 minutes of your time and try to analyze and make sense of any of the data that it provides, you are going to be able to see how little transparency it actually adds to political advertising. For instance, in the UK, the best you can get in terms of regional distribution of where is this political ad being seen is country level. So if it's England, Wales, Northern Ireland, or Scotland. And that's about it. So now if the joys and the power of micro-targeting is the ability to find people in very specific places, what does that give you? Basically nothing, right? It's pretty obvious. You don't need Facebook library to be transparent with you to show you that the British parties will advertise more in England, that Scottish parties will advertise in Scotland, and that parties in Northern Ireland are going to focus in the Northern Irish public, right? You just don't need that transparency. It adds nothing. It gives you nothing, right? In the US and Brazil, you can get states. But again, states are pretty big in Brazil. In Brazil, they're actually the size of countries in Europe. So, not very good information, not very clear. You also get no information about the actual secret sauce of micro-targeting. So who is targeted and why, right? So you can make some inferences, flawed inferences about data on age and gender that Facebook provides to you. The data that they provide is based on exposure, so people that actually saw the ad, but you get nothing and absolutely nothing on who is targeted. This is a bit of a problem because we know that key information about political abuses of micro-targeting is this specific ability to select very specific segments of the population, which is based on the amount of information that these platforms have of us, right? So what matters is not whether candidates in São Paulo can target voters in São Paulo. What matters is whether candidates in São Paulo are targeting voters who did not vote in the last election and who in 2 electoral cycles before had voted for any given party, right? What matters is whether you can target people who are employed or unemployed with particular messages. What matters is this micro segments that are still very much obscure in any ad initiative that you may look at. So if all these magic of the micro-targeting and that hides where the abuses can happen continues to be very much hidden, the transparency initiatives of Facebook, Google, and whatnot are basically a joke, right? They serve nothing. They are, as we would say in Portuguese, for the English to see, right? Or as we would say in English, to put a lipstick on a piglet, right? You're just trying to make it look like you're doing something, but actually it just amounts to nothing. The transparency around the ad libraries by Facebook and Google are doing very little for us researchers, but also for regulators and even courts to investigate political abuses of social media advertising, which are already falling under current electoral legislation in different countries in the first place. So we have these initiatives. They are supposed to help and give transparency, but they don't really. And if you talk to any Facebook worker, they're gonna go to academic conferences and tout the ad library as basically the new wheel, reinventing the wheel, but the library itself gives you nothing. So put shortly, and to just wrap it up, I use the very scientific term again, that this is all a very hot mess and platforms just cannot be left to their own devices to figure it out. The main challenge that I see is that regulators have been, as Clara has rightfully highlighted, very narrowly focused on current platforms and current technologies, right? The Bill of Law in Brazil is very much grounded on mechanisms that are at play, for instance, on WhatsApp, or mechanisms that are at play on Facebook. And there is very little consideration that, you know, the moment that you put a stop to, I don't know, whatever affordance that WhatsApp has, something new can come up tomorrow with new mechanisms. And then what do we do? Do we need new laws? Do we rush and amend that law? So these very narrow focus on specific platform affordances. So for instance, limiting forwarding, determine what is public and what is private. You know, I find it quite funny that WhatsApp says, when they defend themselves, you know, of misinformation, they say, well, most of our messages are, you know, from one person to the other. Most of the groups are with fewer than 10 people, but hey, you can have groups to up to 254. It's like, so what is big and what's not big? I have a research project that has been funded by WhatsApp. So I talked to some of the researchers at somewhat regular basis. And we were trying to determine what is in our research, because we wanted to pose a survey question about group sizes. And we had a chat with them. So like, you know, what should we consider a large group size? They will not say, right? Like, is it large if it's more than 10? Is it large if it's less than? What is large? They don't know, they don't tell. So if we focus too much on these mechanisms, then any legislation, any attempt to regulate anything is dead on arrival, right? Think regulation of online behaviors and platforms is always kind of a cat and mouse situation, because even though we may be able to curb and prevent some bad things from happening, those with really bad intentions are always going to be looking for ways to circumvent, right? When a few months ago, when the fake news Bill of Rights in Brazil, Bill of Law in Brazil was being discussed, I started seeing, and you know, even before it was approved, I started seeing people forwarding stuff on WhatsApp saying, you know, copy and paste because you can't forward anymore because WhatsApp is gonna track you and whatever. So people are always looking for ways to circumvent regulation, right? And in my view, the society-wide consequences of a rush debate about these issues that doesn't spend enough time thinking about not only what are the things we need to regulate and how we should be regulating them, but also thinks about how do we kind of future-proof this regulation. It's just too damaging for the debate to be rushed. That's all I had to say. I didn't really track my time, but I think I'm on time.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much for this. That was quite thorough. And now we're going to move on to questions. And in order to give you even more time to answer, because we don't have a lot of time left in the panel, so I want to maximize the time that you still have left, I'm going to pose both questions. They are both directed at one of you, but any one of you can, if they want, comment on any of the two questions. But I'll pose the two questions, and then I'll give each of you slightly more than 3-4 minutes, a maximum 5 minutes, really maximum 5 minutes for final comments and replying to the questions. So the first one, Cynthia asked Chris so she wants to know about spectrum, in the spectrum of content moderation by artificial intelligence, can intellectual property protection be an obstacle to the transparency and the auditability of the algorithms? So again, this is addressed to Chris. If Clara and Patricia want to comment on this, address this question as well, they're more than welcome. And then our second question is by Clara, and she's addressing this to Clara. So Clara, you talked about structured regulation. How do you think self-regulation or co-regulation can interact with regulation by the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches? So we'll do this in the order that you spoke. So we'll start with Chris, move on to Clara, and then finish with Patricia. You can either address both or none, or just provide final remarks. It's up to you, but just please keep it short.
Yeah, very quickly. So the answer to the first question is yes. And one of the joys of studying disinformation is that it is the, I don't know if it's quite as hot as Patricia thinks, but certainly it is a very messy topic. And therefore it's a joyous topic at the intersection of content regulation and what we used to think of as carriage regulation. It deals with the technical possibilities as well as the human rights law elements of the internet. So yeah, of course, companies will throw all kinds of reasons why they can't be transparent. And in any case, transparency wouldn't be enough, but certainly they will throw all kinds of reasons why they can't be transparent. And just one comment on the second part, just agreeing with what Clara said in her presentation. It's not just incredibly dangerous to try to transplant German law to Brazil or English law to South Africa or whatever else. It is fundamentally dishonest by legislators to say that's what they're doing. Because they know completely that there will be no enforcement of the law. I mean, to be honest, there's very little enforcement of, for instance, privacy law anywhere in the European Union, with the exception of Germany. So, you know, I find myself in very strong agreement with Patricia and Clara that essentially, are legislators trying to do anything about disinformation? No. And specifically in the countries where disinformation has won elections, the people in charge of election law, and including disinformation law, are the specific people who have been spreading disinformation to get themselves elected. So why would they have any interest in anything more than a very tokenistic view of disinformation? There's a kind of disinformation catch-22 going on, which is that anyone who wanted to actually achieve any kind of regulation of disinformation would never be allowed anywhere near the levers of power to do so. Whereas the people who actually benefit from disinformation are absolutely put in charge of having the ability to do nothing about it. So I think that's our disinformation catch-22 to completely depress the audience at the end of the session.
Clara?
Yes, I'm gonna skip the first one. I'm gonna go straight to the second one that was directed specifically to me. So I think the idea of co-regulation, and you know, please, Chris, let me know if I say anything that is not exactly accurate. The idea of co-regulation is there is an interaction, right, between private sector and between the state in order to regulate a certain market. So different authors will call co-regulation different things. There is even people who will say that intermediary liability, the 230 in the US, is a co-regulation mechanism because it's delegation, you know, legislative delegation. That's not the co-regulation that I talk about when I talk about co-regulation for the internet. You know, what I think we should have in mind is just acknowledge that self-regulation will be inevitable to a certain degree, and try to make it more transparent, try to make it more accountable, involve state actors who can monitor, who can be more on the way that self-regulation works, and then codes of practices being validated by public authorities, and this sort of arrangements is the way that this would take place. And I think this could even be a valid proposal for the bill of law that we're discussing in Brazil. I just don't think that this is what's being proposed. And I just think that before proposing this, there has to be a lot of thought put into what is this council or what is the self-regulation that is supposed to be, you know, instead of just importing it from somewhere where it didn't really land after all, you know. So this is my major critique here. I do think that there is something to be done about online harms. You know, even though I'm adopting the UK label, I'm not necessarily embracing the proposal there. But I think there is something to be done towards regulating platforms. I really do. So I wouldn't like to leave the impression that I think that this is not something that we should mess with, that nobody's doing anything. I think we should be doing something. I just think the Brazilian proposal is incredibly audacious. And right now I'm really inclined to believing that perhaps it should be, in fact, more restrictive to structure, even though Patricia has pointed out some really good reasons why even that is not going to be enough. Should I wrap up too, Ivar? Okay, it was really, really nice to hear to you, Patricia, and to you, Chris. I'm really happy to having been here. Thank you so much for the organization again. And for anyone, I know that some of the students that are watching are the ones that I have spoken to in your research group the other day, Ivar. So if any one of you would like to be in touch, and I am always available, and thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Clara. Patricia?
Right. Just to kind of quickly touch on both. One interesting thing for the first question of the extent to which platforms can call intellectual property not to be transparent. It is kind of interesting when new actors surface, right? So the controversy with TikTok in the US, they have said that they would be willing to publish and be transparent about their algorithms because they want the US government to know that they're not targeting Americans with Chinese propaganda. So it's kind of interesting how even among companies and across companies, there are different ways of talking about this, and also how sometimes new players will try to make it look like they are going to be the ones doing the right thing so that they can put the other ones in kind of like a bad light, right? So it's like throwing shade, to use the common lingo. It's also what's happening between Facebook and Twitter, right? So Zuckerberg criticizes Dorsey because Dorsey is banning political ads, and then Dorsey criticizes Facebook because Facebook doesn't do enough for misinformation. So it's all like, they're all out to fend for themselves. And going to the second point, and again to the point that Clara made, it is important, to some extent, the ones who will do things are going to be platforms, but it is important that platforms follow basic guidelines and regulations for transparency, because if not, again, they will do things for us to make believe. They will make it look like they're doing something. They're not really doing anything that matters. And even when they do things, even if they label content, even if they take content down, the inconsistencies in the ecosystem, because none of us uses only one platform, will contribute to sow discord and confusion to the public. So the end goal, which is make the public less confused and give the public better information environment to navigate, is not achieved by the inconsistencies in how platforms are enforcing pretty poorly and kind of unevenly their own policies. I think even though the role of what the exact role that the regulation should take and how this can be enforced is a big question that smarter people have failed to answer for now, and it's kind of beyond my my area of research. To me, part of the problem is that, again, if left to their own devices, platforms have no intention and no interest to actually fix these problems, because and as Chris properly mentioned, nor do politicians, because they are in fact the ones benefiting from these dynamics as well. So when I say maybe we want to focus on actors a bit more instead of focusing on the types of content that we should be looking at, especially in terms of disinformation and not broader online harms like hateful speech, violent threats, and etc., which to me completely different category, and a lot more clear cut, both to identify and also to enforce. But part of the reason why I think we should focus on politicians is that they are the ones who are capable of inflicting greater damage by leveraging and abusing these mechanisms. So they are also the ones that should be more forcefully punished. But because they're the ones deciding what to do with whom, I am pretty skeptical that anything is going to happen. And that is all that I had to say. Thank you all for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to share this table with Clara and Chris. So I'll thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this today.
Thank you, Patricia. And again, thank you, Chris, Clara, Patricia, for taking the time and joining the master's and doctorate students from IDP, from the Catholic University of Porto Alegre, and from the FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro. In this fourth panel in our international seminar. We are now going to focus tomorrow on artificial intelligence in content moderation. So for all of you joining us again tomorrow, same time, a new set of foreign panelists, and I hope that we'll finish this seminar with a high quality debate, the same as we had today. Thank you again for our attendees, especially those that posed the questions. And without further ado, I'd like to close our panel today. Thank you, everyone.